So in this first session, we have 5 people sitting at the table, representing 5 different European networks. Starting from here, Riccardo Rossella from Civil Society Europe, Giada Negri from the European Civic Forum, Hanna Surmatz from Philea, the Philanthropy Europe Association, Marianna Belalba from European Center for Nonprofit Law, and last but not least, Balázs Dénes from the European Civil Liberties Network. And I asked each of you to provide an 8 to 10 minute presentation on the different aspects of work around European civic space. And maybe we can go in this order, starting with Riccardo and I asked him to talk about the joint campaign of Civil Society Europe and the main demands or the main asks of civil society towards the institutions. Riccardo. And you have to push, yep.
Yeah, that should be working, yes. So thank you, Vera, for the invitation and for the introduction. It's great to be here and great to have another event to keep the discussion around the need for civil society strategy alive. Indeed, it's nowadays we can say it's a long-standing demand of European civil society in different forms and in different capacity. As Civil Society Europe, we have been campaigning for that for quite a while, and specifically we have done so in the last 1.5 years with a specific campaign called Civil Society for EU, which kind of provided a framework for European civil society to, again, to keep high the tension on the need of the civil society sector and the need for concrete policy frameworks such as a civil society strategy, but also an agreement on civil dialogue in order to improve and strengthen the engagement of different civil society organizations into the policy-making cycle, both at the European and at the national level. And the response has been great. I mean, we've been coordinating this campaign together with a lot of other organizations, networks, and platforms, including the European Civic Forum, Philea, Ökotárs, and many more. We had more than 250 organizations from all over Europe supporting this campaign, which again is a sign of how strongly these demands are felt among all of us, I can say. We've been engaging with party leaders at the European level. We've met with the cabinet of presidents of the European Commission, von der Leyen. We have reached out to hundreds of candidates to the EP elections. More than 400 of them have signed our campaign pledge in support of these concrete policy asks and in support of the civil society sector, more broadly speaking. And out of those, we have now more than 100 members of the European Parliament, elected members of the European Parliament, who have signed our pledge. As we know, on the other hand, the results of the European elections have not been great for progressive forces. And unfortunately, we're witnessing already some backlash on the environmental and social agenda, and we are aware that we will have some tough or challenging, to say the least, 5 years ahead during the upcoming mandate. So we know that we will have to keep pushing, keep struggling for preserving and enhancing civic space all over Europe. But on the other hand, we also know that we have some allies that we can count on. We have this network of more than 100 MEPs I was mentioning that are supportive of our requests. We have 2 vice presidents of the European Parliament who have been charged of relations with civil society. And as I'm speaking, my colleagues in Brussels are finalizing the organization of an event that we will have this evening in the European Parliament, indeed, at the presence of both the vice presidents and other supportive MEPs and civil society representatives in order to relaunch the discussion about what's the way forward for strengthening civil space in the Union and all Europe. We have the Commissioner designate for Democracy, Justice and the Rule of Law, Michael McGrath, and in the mission letter detailing his mandate, he was asked by President von der Leyen, and I quote, to step up engagement with civil society on democracy, rule of law, and related issues, and to build a civil society platform to support more systematic civil dialogue and work to strengthen protection of civil society activists and human rights defenders in their work. In the previous commission, there was no commissioner with such a clear reference about civil society in their mandate. So this was not obvious. Of course, these are just starting points. Much remains to be done. Much remains to be seen also in a way. So in terms of what comes next, I think that the first step that we envisage is to monitor how these initiatives will evolve, how they will be implemented, especially the civil society platform under the mandate of Commissioner McGrath, but also how these different roles regarding relations with civil society will be implemented. What will be the concrete proposals that will be put forward? And then that's, I mean, again, these are the starting points that we want to build on. As Civil Society Europe, as networks of European civil society organizations, that's our main goal for the years to come, to keep working with the Parliament, to build on the relations with this network of supportive MEPs. We are calling also for the establishment of an interest group on civil society in the European Parliament as a cross-group political space to have meaningful discussion with MEPs from different political groups, and to keep also the discussion about the need of a civil society strategy alive. And and engage also with the two vice presidents of the European Parliament, and engage with the Commissioner McGrath, his cabinet, and other relevant commissioners who have some relations with civil society in their mandates, again, to keep these mandates meaningful and make sure that the proposals that will be developed will suit the needs of the civil society sector. As a last point, to keep highlighting some encouraging signs, I think it is worth mentioning also the proposal for a directive on European cross-border associations, which aims to help non-profit associations to conduct cross-border activities by removing some of the legal and administrative barriers that still exist. For instance, additional registrations requirements when operating across borders, so operating in multiple member states. And this is a good proposal. It is a welcome step forward to create an enabled space for civil society in Europe. We're not there yet. And I mean that the Parliament, the European Parliament, approved this proposal back in March 2024. And now the ball is in the hands of the Council, where we see some resistance, some obstructions. So that's also one of the main files we're focusing on Civil Society Europe, together with many partners, also in different member states. We have also developed a handbook for kind of providing an overview on this proposal. We have some templates, also a letter to address to the different governments, national governments, to push for the approval of this proposal in the Council. So in case anyone is interested, I'm happy to have a chat also about this later on during this event. To wrap up, the political context we have now is the best that we would hope for. No. There are some encouraging signs, yes. So I would say that's the starting point for the years to come. We know it won't be easy, but let's build on that and keep working together to make sure that in the next years this call, again, long-standing call for a civil society strategy will finally become a reality. And I will leave also to other colleagues to delve more in details into some of the aspects I mentioned and some of the elements that relate to civic space during their interventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Riccardo. Thank you for keeping the time and for this evaluation of the current situation. Then I would pass on the floor to Giada, who I asked to go a bit more into how we can use the Commission mandate and to talk also about the protection of civic space defenders, which is sort of a new issue, but maybe you can also mention why it's needed.
Hello, it's nice to see a lot of familiar faces and also new ones. I work for the European Civic Forum, which is a network of over 100 NGOs from across Europe. And we have been monitoring the developments of civic space at the national and European level. And we have been very active in advocating for proactive actions at the European level for enabling, supporting, engaging, and protecting civil society as a key pillar of democracy and the rule of law. So before I get into the assessment of the mandate of the commissioners and our expectations, I thought that maybe it would be useful to start by giving a framing of how we understand democracy and the current backsliding. The European Civic Forum looks at democracy as interconnected, not just, doesn't only look at how participatory frameworks work, but also how democracy delivers. So in this sense, we cannot look at democracy and the shrinking civic space without looking at the rising inequalities, the fight against rights of specific groups, and the securitization of the EU borders. We believe that a truly transformative and coherent EU democracy agenda cannot be developed in silos. And really must drive, first of all EU policies. So not just democracy and rule of law policies, but the wide array of policies that the EU works on, including socioeconomic, financial policies, security policies, and so on. And why I start with this framing is that it's very important to have this framing in mind when we look at the letters, the mission letters of the Commissioner McGrath and also Virkkunen. So the Commissioner for Democracy and Rule of Law, and also the Commissioner on Democracy, Tax Sovereignty and Security. First of all, we have let's start with the good news. As we heard from Riccardo, we have for the first time the protection of civic space and also the dialogue with civil society recognized as one of the priorities of the European Commission. And we will build on this as we will push as much as possible to use this in a proactive and constructive way. But we cannot ignore that these positive signs happen in a context that is grim. And I don't want to discourage you because as European civil society, we will be fighting to take advantage of these positive signs. But the way that democracy and the rule of law are framed in the current mission letters is concerning in the sense that it comes from defense, security, borders, and market competition point of view. And we cannot ignore this. And we face the paradox. On the one hand, we look at the EU institutions to, as I said, be proactive in ensuring accountability of member states when they restrict rule of law and democracy. On the other hand, we face this political context. So what is our expectations towards the commissioner, and how are we organizing in Brussels to make these expectations a reality? We have a really important expectation, starting with what Riccardo mentioned, the promise of stepping up the civil dialogue with the civil society. When we talk about the civil dialogue, we really talk from the civil society perspective. Of course, our expectation is to co-create policies. And we see the role of the commissioner as a role to streamline rights and values, not just in the rule of law and democracy policies, but across all EU policies. And we are organizing inside the Civil Society Europe to propose civil dialogue agreement with the EU institutions to ensure that civil society drives all policies linked to democracy and rule of law, but not only. Then when it comes to this other promise of protection of civil society, I think it's important to start from the fact that protection is just one element of a thriving civic space. We need enabling laws, enabling practices, we need funding, and then of course we need protection. Again, with the Civil Society Europe and some colleagues, especially Liberties, we are part of a coalition that has been, first of all, mapping what elements of protections already exist in Europe. And then we are coordinating to propose some options to the EU. We have seen that there are a number of elements of protection that already exist, some at the national, some at the European level, but these elements are fragmented, are not coordinating. So we are really strongly calling for building and for the EU to really support the build-up of national level protection ecosystem, coordinated at the European level to ensure that there is data collection and also that these are linked with the accountability measures at the EU level. Then we believe that there is an important diplomatic role that the EU and especially the Commissioner for Rule of Law and Democracy needs to play. It will be important that we call for, first of all, a systematic engagement on all civic space deterioration, so in all countries, not just some, and also to ensure that the civic space issues are incorporated into political dialogues with the member states. In this sense, we are working with the ECNL to create a small pilot of an early warning mechanism to collect, to be aware of deterioration signs early on in member states, and then to engage the EU in response. And we will push to ensure that the commissioner himself responds to these restrictions using the full scale of its diplomatic role. Finally, as I said, protection is one slice. It's important that the civil society has a framework to thrive, and we cannot do this without funding. So we think that it's really important to send a strong message to the EU. First of all, that EU funding should be accessible and better organized. Of course, we will need to defend the CERV, making sure that the current amount is protected and, if possible, expanded. But I think that there is also a role that the EU has to play in terms of sending a signal to all other private and public donors that civil society fighting for democracy and rights needs funding. And yeah, maybe we will hear more from the rest of the colleagues.
Don't take Hanna's thieves away.
So conclusion, we will work closely together, and I think we will need to work at all levels, EU and national, to make all these expectations a reality. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Giada. I think we will go into the specific issues like protection more detail in later. But now I would pass on to Hanna. Since we started to talk about money, Philanthropy Europe Association obviously is an organization of the private donors foundations in Europe. So this is why I asked Hanna to talk mostly about money.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vera. I'm really happy to be here. So as Vera said, I represent the philanthropic organizations and also the national networks of foundations and donors. So we understand ourselves to be also part of civil society, but we are also funding and supporting civil society. So it's this dual entry that I represent here also today. Vera asked me about covering 3 topics, big lines: public funding, philanthropic funding, and then a third element, which is around how the public donor community, the private donor community engages in dialogue among each other, and there's need for that, but also how they engage with the civil society and the need to engage more around that. Before I start, I just wanted to do a quick cross-check. How many of you do get public funding? That could be EAA grant support directly or through fund operators or through CERV grants, if you can raise your hand just to get an idea. Okay, so I think that's the majority in the room. And how many of you get a support from philanthropic organizations, foundations? And if I reduce the element of the matching fund, how many of you do get direct support from philanthropic organizations? Okay, there's some, but not so many. Thank you. Just looking at the urgent situation we are in. So I think what is clear is that we cannot take civil society space for granted. And that's the elections have been a real wake-up call for us, the EU elections, and also developments at the national level. So what we have been developing with the European civil society strategy and defense mechanisms is absolutely vital and important, and we need to continue. And we see there is a shift within the EU policy landscape towards defense, towards competition. That's an area that we need to, in a way, use to also make sure that our entries are relevant in this context, but we need to also make sure we defend our space. And this efforts, of course, needs funding. And that is crucial. So if I start with the public funding cluster, of course, there are the EAA Norwegian grants. There's been a new kind of agreement signed now in September in 2024. So there will be, I think, 1.5 million euros we're already supporting also civil society between 2014 and 2021. And there is now a new 3.2 billion going to 15 member states for the next round. So that's a serious amount. And this is very valuable funding resources for all of you. We also have within our membership several of the grant operators, Bodosaki, Batoro, Gulbenkian, and there's also the Civil Society Development Foundation. So there's a lot of your peers also in the room here who are also fund operators, and that's an important role to play. Now, looking at the CERV, the CERV has been a real change maker also for civil society in Europe. So it's really been the first time, I would say, that there was a real commitment from the EU also to defend civic space issues inside the EU. So there was also a strong call made by all of you, by the sector, that this is needed. And we as Philea have also strongly supported that there needs to be public funding going into this. And given the political landscape that we are in now, we all have to urgently advocate for a strong continuation of the CERV, because it is not for granted that this CERV will continue and how it will continue. So we need to really also signal this message strongly. All in all, the CERV was much appreciated by the civil society, and it provides citizens' equality, rights and values funding into civil society. It helps also addressing gaps at the national level, which is very important. It also is under direct management of the EU, which was a strong advantage because also it was enabling national funding in, I would say, countries where the governments potentially have been less friendly towards civil society. And that's, of course, an element that we consider absolutely vital to continue. It includes project grants, and it also includes a re-granting mechanism. I will not go into technicalities around the CERV program, but we know that civil society has also been collecting views in terms of how even the CERV program could be improved, because there were some recommendations made. Also, Giada referred to some of them. Of course, it needs to have an overall increased budget. Grants needs to be also reflecting inflation, which was a key issue over the past years, and several projects suffered from it. We also have a call to enlarge, the operating grants should also be enlarged in terms of duration potentially. There should be easier processes around the application process, because it's quite complicated and complex to craft these applications. And then the reporting is another element which is very burdensome. And if the percentage of the budget of a CSO is composed over a third into money that needs to go into the application and the administration of the grants, then there is also an issue of in question there of the effective use of the funds provided. So there is a call to make it easier. I talked also about the length or the extension of the length of the duration of also project funding. Then making sure that there is already a wide coverage, but also what Giada referred to is this interlink of the different issues, that should also be reflected in the CERV program. And finally, a point that was also raised, it's about the importance of having dialogue. Dialogue around the CERV, the design, the implementation, and also the evaluation of programs. And to set up this dialogue group should be, of course, key, but there needs also to be a better structured dialogue involving civil society around this. Relevance, yes, I talked about this. This is absolutely relevant. We need to have a continuation of CERV, and we need a strong CERV. We need a positive narrative also for civil society and for the need to have this funding. A strong civil society and a strong philanthropy is a backbone of democracy. And that should be also understood, of course, by public donors as well as by the philanthropic donors. And I come to that as a second point. So in addition to the huge amounts, which are really the bulk of funding going into civil society comes from the public sector, from the EA grants and from the EU, with CERV being the key funding portfolio. But we also have a number of philanthropic organizations who care about the issue. And we have around 180,000 public benefit foundations in Europe. Within our membership, we have around 300 foundations and funders networks. And among those, some are active in the field of civic space issues, but not all of them. Of course, foundations, if you understand private foundations, they have their own statutes, they're bound to their own mission. which is one thing. But even where their statutes would allow them to act, sometimes the laws even are restrictive. So we sense that sometimes foundations are not allowed to engage in political activities. We also face restrictions on that from that on the ground. We also sense that there are sometimes restrictions in terms of who they can fund and how they can fund. So there's more to be done also of enlarging that space. And and we are as Philea, of course, working on that. We also see that foundations are coming together to discuss. So within Philea, we have 3 networks, one around democracy, one about journalism funders network, and one also connector, which deals with also civic space issues in Central and Eastern Europe. And these funders come together to explore. But what we also consider is very relevant that these funders, of course, also talk to the civil society much more, and we will need to see how to enable that. Funders have also decided that they can potentially become more effective if they join forces and if they pool forces. So back, I think it was an annual forum that Philea, at the time European Foundation Center, organized in Poland, in Warsaw. There was a decision taken to pool fund. And the result of that is Civitates, which is now also there to support civil society from the private philanthropy sector. And yes, philanthropy also joins forces, of course, with wider civil society on some of the key asks. So we need to make sure we have enabling frameworks, and we have also no barriers to cross-border philanthropy. We don't have FARA laws at the national level, which are also restriction to cross-border philanthropy. And we have to make sure that all the security agenda, money laundering, terrorism financing policy does not unduly restrict our sector. So we need to build strong alliances to pursue this agenda. And just the third element I wanted to mention is about the need to also bridge what are the public donors doing and what are the philanthropic donors doing. How can they potentially be more strategic? And that's a development that was also kickstarting the last couple of years ago. There was the Council recommendations on civic space issues, which also included a recommendation for a donor dialogue to happen. So that's something where the philanthropy sector and DG Justice and some other DGs have started discussing who's doing what. So that can be conversation, of course, on who is doing what in which country, but also who's doing what on what issue, and where are potential gaps, and where are potential ways to have smart ways of collaborating. So foundations can, of course, fulfill also to some extent this matching fund requirement, which is needed if you apply for an EU grant, for example. But they can also provide additional support. They can provide non-financial support, but they can also provide additional support where potentially the public funders cannot go. So that's something where we sense there is an urgent need to have more of this dialogue and to learn who's doing what, and also explore what happens if EU funding leaves. Is there a role for private philanthropy to also step in? What happens for those who are not successfully applying for EU funding, but have undergone all this long due diligence checks and made all the efforts to apply for EU funding? Could there be potentially something that those that applied could have a certain, label of some kind, which could make it potentially interesting also for private philanthropy to look at this? So there is a lot of ideas in there, and happy to also get your feedback during the break and after to see what can be done. Then a final element, of course, foundations have at their disposal the grant making, I would say, support that they do, and they also have endowments that are normally invested in the markets. But more and more foundations are also considering how they are doing their asset allocation, and if they can also do their asset allocation in a more mission-driven way. So say not invest in tobacco, but consider investing into social enterprises, for example. And there's also a way of how some of the EU funding programs are set up. Here also with the Global Gateway at global level, but also there are some interesting financial instruments under InvestEU, where also potentially foundations could come in, so that even more, I would say, capital and money is going into also social windows and social movements. So I would say I would end here and say that we are hearing you, that funding is needed, and funding is needed from public and private actors, and there needs to be more collaboration and coordination, and we are eager to move ahead with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna. Lots of information as usual. And as an organization that is managing a CERV grant, I can only underline the importance of what you said in relation to improving the CERV. Next up is Marianna, and I must admit that with ECNL, we are now partners in crime, or in a project that is called Monitoring Action on Civic Space. And I asked Marianna to specifically talk about why do we need to monitor civic space, what's happened, what's needed, and why we started this project that we are doing together, also with CERV grants.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vera. I am going to take you to sort of the backbone of why we know that there is a need for advocacy and resources, which is the monitoring aspect of civic space, which many civil society do, including Liberties with the Rule of Law report. There is a couple of organizations I'm seeing here that are part of the project. So we basically start with 7 national organizations and 2 regional organizations, ECNL and European Civic Forum, with the aim of creating a methodology that monitor civic space or enable environment, whatever the term we want to use, in a way that is systematic, that is comprehensive, but also takes into account EU level standards, but also the national nuance and challenge that each organization is facing. And we all know probably that that job is done. A big conversation that we have when implementing this project was we sort of know the civic space restrictions out there. So why we will continue or we want to build this monitoring tool. And I think a key challenge, and I think Giada alluded to it, is the increased restrictions that we all know is not new. It's been happening for at least a decade at the EU level. And there is some level of recognition, but it always goes towards a few countries. One of them where we are at now, right? Almost seems that just a couple of countries at the EU level are having serious restrictions, while we know that maybe in more subtle ways, there is sort of a systematic deterioration of civic space at the EU level. And we were talking about protection, I think, in Vienna a few months ago. There was a debate about to what extent the EU and EU institutions are actually acknowledging the extent of the civic space restrictions. So we wanted to create this methodology to monitor civic space with a potential long-term vision that this is applied to more countries, not just the 7 countries that we're piloting now, to have a comprehensive, but more importantly, a EU index that has been called by civil society, but also by other EU institutions. So we are at the final stage. Next week, actually, we are meeting in Brussels to sort of finalize this methodology. And the 7 partners in Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, Denmark, the Netherlands, and France are going to implement in 2025 this methodology. And it is a pilot, meaning that we're also going to be gathering feedback about the challenge of implementing, collecting data in these countries, and also the strengths of this methodology. And this is with the aim of further applying this methodology to other countries. And I go back to what Hanna was saying about coordination, and I think that's key, that sort of different donors are speaking about this, because at the same time that we're building this methodology with this aim to coordinate and have a comprehensive view at the EU level, we see that many other networks also are developing monitoring tools. And what we want to achieve is to strengthen and elevate that. So our vision is that in 2026, we all gather together all the different methodology and tools just to see what has been the challenge. When I mentioned the countries, it was very clear that we intentionally chose countries that have very different civic space environments. We have Hungary, the Netherlands, and Denmark, right? Different challenges. The idea about behind this is to be able to have a methodology that can apply to different contexts so we can compare data over time among countries, but also that captures the nuance of each civic space environment, while at the same time sort of elevating, and this is probably a challenge that we're going to encounter next year, is what are the groups who are particularly impacted by these restrictions and how we can highlight that so the advocacy and the resources continue to strengthen this. So you will hear more from us probably in the next year about the outcome of this pilot. But I think for me, one of the most unique aspects of this project is what Giada mentioned, which is the early warning system. I know at the global level, there is a EU project that is already implementing or at a very initial stage of implementing an early warning system, but it's not such things in Europe or even before this global project in civil society. There is a lot of early warning systems in the humanitarian sector. So this is sort of like a pilot of something that is needed, but how it's going to be implemented in practice. And we have a lot of discussions about how this early warning system looks like. You could argue that civil society, it is already very good at detecting when restrictions are happening, even the early signs of deterioration, and the whole idea of what is an early sign of deterioration in each different country. We sort of end up with this conclusion that our energy will probably go towards the EU institutions, right? Even if we build a system of alerts and we know when to trigger the system, what to do when we trigger the system, we need action from the EU institutions. So I think our efforts, probably led by ECF, will go towards a dialogue with the EU institutions, actually co-designing this tool together to sort of also understand how they react to these restrictions, what are the challenges they face, how they coordinate internally, and how we can strengthen the system where there is eventually, in a few years, a EU-level early warning system that prompts strong actions and actually avoid further deterioration of civic space. And then finally, and I think this is sort of a conclusion of what everyone has been saying, is that for me, the few issues that we might need to tackle when implementing these projects are first, coordination. We do have a big goal of, if not building, at least coordinating national partners into a methodology tool that, if not assessing the same, to be coordinated enough so we are all seeing the same things and coordinated in a way. So that is sort of a challenge that needs to be coordinated with donors. CERV was mentioned. This is a CERV project, but there are at least 5 more projects with the same activities that needs to be coordinated, not just because it will be good to have a comprehensive tool, but also because I think we're missing out in terms of learnings. It seems that there is so much of national level monitoring, and we still need to share what have we learned about this. It always seems that we sort of start from scratch. And I think this is an opportunity for us to sort of coordinate and see how we can sort of learn and elevate this. The second one is sustainability. Again, goes back to the funders, right? If we aim to monitor this on a regular basis, we need long-term funding, because the time that we spend applying for CERV or reapplying is time that sort of goes in the middle of an ongoing monitoring tool, and money that, quite frankly, could also go to action and advocacy, right? Like what we do when we know this challenge that we have. And finally, with the early warning system, I think the biggest challenge will be how we go beyond reaction, right? Like we need to build a system that actually put at the core of what we do prevention, and what does that mean, and how we actually get there. So for us, I think it's going to be a very busy year. And yeah, we'll be happy to share a little bit more. And any of you who are working towards the same goal, we'll be happy to coordinate in the working groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianna. And I'd just like to add that it may not be apparent at first, but developing this monitoring tool and methodology is a more difficult task than it seems, because of course you could spend all your energy on it, but to create something that is measurable and efficient at the same time is quite a challenging task. So let's see how we develop next week and afterwards. And the rule of law report as one kind of monitoring tool has been already mentioned. And last but not least, I would like to ask Balázs, because Liberties have been very closely monitoring the development of the rule of law report and criticizing how it's done and what happens with it. And I would like to ask Balázs to share their findings and views on this.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Vera. I was asked to talk about the future of the rule of law reports, but I guess to understand or predict the future of anything, it's probably worth it to talk about the presence and the recent past of these reports. I know that some people are more familiar with the European Commission's annual rule of law reports than others, so I try to provide something which is interesting for everyone. I know self-promotion is a terrible way to start a presentation, but if you work for a human rights organization, then you are daily faced with the fact that it's so difficult to measure advocacy because your goals are somehow often shady, and the field is always super crowded. We do everything together. But this particular issue, the annual rule of law monitoring exercise done by the Commission, is something Liberties is very proud of, because we were writing about this 8 years ago. We proposed this for so many times that at the end, when the Commission decided to do this, we also realized that we just can't, leave this without reaction. So doing what? About 4 years ago in 2020, the European Commission finally decided that it will launch a series of reports, an annual cycle in which they measure the rule of law situation in every single member state at the EU. And of course, the question arises, why then and why not before? And in some sense, there's probably an actor who's even more responsible for this than Liberties, and that's the Prime Minister of Hungary, and the whole, way how he is, approaching democracy. So after 10 years of Orban systematically destroying Hungarian rule of law institution checks and balances, and after 4 years, after 1 year of seeing that the Polish government might do the same, they actually decided that they have to do something about it. Well, if it's the EU, so if they do something, they just can't do it on 2 countries. That's actually one of the interesting and challenging part of the rule of law report. Of course, it's understandable that they have to measure all the countries, but at the same time, it's challenging, to say the minimum, to measure media freedom with the same tools and in the same report in Finland and in Hungary, or measure the level of corruption in, let's say, Bulgaria and Sweden. So, that gives the beauty of the exercise. I think it's, don't get me wrong, I really think it's a great thing, and it's a very good thing that the European Commission is doing these reports, and it's also important to acknowledge that there is progress. 4 years ago, there was, just simply observation, the reports. Then a year later, there came the country-specific recommendations, and obviously a year later came the follow-up of those recommendations. And this year, for the first time, candidate countries are also covered. So again, there is progress. But at the same time, if we are asked to talk about how this could be done better, We always have great ideas, as you can imagine, because that's what we do. And we identified three main areas where the reports could have been, could be better in the future. Again, this is not the future as it will be. This is the future as we imagine if one day the rule of law reports done by the Commission will get stronger. So the first, I say three, but these are all really connected and part of the same thing, which is how to make the annual reporting exercise into a more integral part of the entire rule of law, toolbox, how to turn monitoring into action. So the first is more transparency and precision when measuring progress. In the 2024 report, what we saw is that the Commission said that nearly 70%, that is 7 out of 10, of all previous recommendations were followed by member states. It's beautiful, but at the same time, if you take a closer look, you will realize that everything is mentioned there. If a government just holds a press conference and says that we will approach this positively, that's already progress according to the Commissioner's report. So our own analysis shows that it's actually below 20%. So it would be important to say that recommendations, where significantly progress was measurable or was fully implemented. That would be the part when you say that the recommendations were follow up. The second is the effective enforcement of those recommendations. And now here, remember what I said about measuring very different countries from, with the same magnifying glass. Countries like Hungary and in some sense, Poland. Remember that the report 24 covers 23, Romania, Slovakia, and Greece and Malta. So very often recommendations in these countries are completely disregarded or very little progress was made. Unfortunately, in countries where the rule of law situation is better, there is also a practice of completely disregarding the Commission's recommendations. Now, you can, of course, say that, yes, but their recommendations are not, attached to so significant systematic issues. Yes, but it's true. At the same time, it's true that if they don't implement those recommendations, the so-called bad countries can also say that, well, if they don't bother, why would we? So again, that's the problem of measuring everyone at the same time. The third is, again, to integrate the annual report and reporting cycle into the larger rule of law architecture. And here, I think after 4 years, we can probably state that the annual report in itself is not going to be effective against governments who's deliberately and systematically undermine rule of law. But there are other tools, Article 7 procedures, infringement procedures, and budgetary conditionality. It would be extremely important to connect the report to these other actions. Now, if we talk about the future, again, that's my potential version of the future, so we don't know much. You kept hearing about these mission letters, the commissioners or the future commissioners are having. I mean, the EU is an interesting government, if you like. Probably only in the world when you don't know much about the portfolios, but you do know that there will be how many ministries and how many commissioners there will be. So this is which is why it's always important to see what are going to be the actual task, what is going to be the actual elements of the portfolio, and there is an important sentence in this mission letter. The Justice Commissioner is actually tasked to consolidate the rule of law report and establish closer links between the rule of law report and enforcement mechanisms. So that's great. That's what we want. At the Commissioner's pre-appointment hearing, he actually talked about the reports. He said that he will continue these reports, so that's great. He also said that he doesn't want to be in the endless, monitoring phase and just writing these reports. He wants to see action, and when backsliding happen, there will be, action following that backsliding. So this is all great. At the same time, he's a politician. So he also talked about the universality of the reports and all member states should be scrutinized. And everything will start with a dialogue, which is very much needed, of course. And he sees himself as an honest broker. He also said that they will consider existing tools, but also potentially new tools. Now, if you ask me, it's not the missing tools which are making hard or difficult to act against non-complying governments, but the fact that they don't really use those tools. Remember what happens with the Article 7 procedure against Hungary, which is going on for, I don't know, 6 years, 7 years, and every single presidency, if they belong to a pro rule of law, country, they say, "Oh, we will make progress. You will see progress," but then, unfortunately, nothing happens. So, as I said, these were the big structural changes. Um, I admit that they would require some thinking, but there could be areas where instant, changes are possible, and that they would mean a really instant improvement. So the first thing is how the Commission is engaging with civil society organizations during the monitoring, during the actual exercise. Um, Transparency with whom and why they consult. Our own partners are somehow very frustrated in some countries because they contribute, and then they are not even listed. It's not just a question of reference, but it's also the question of whom the Commission sees when they organize a country visit. So that's also proactive communication about country visits. Like our partners are asking us when the country visit starts. So the way how it's done, when they open the new reporting cycle, mid-end January, they start to organize country visits. Now, obviously, probably the Commission is not that careful about booking tickets in advance than an organizers of a civic presidency conference, but I'm pretty sure that those meetings are already scheduled in their calendars. Yet, without asking, without doing your research, and without contacting people, no one has an idea which countries are on the beginning of the list and which are following later. So proactive communication would help. Also recognition of contributions. Sometimes it's just a gesture. If you really make an effort and contribute, it would be great to see you, let's say your name as in a reference. And of course, and CSOs are repeatedly asking for more time for contribution. And that, connects us to the second big area about the dissemination and communication. The timing is criticized by many. So, the collection starts in January. Civil society organizations have very little time. Practically, in order to make a real contribution, you most probably will work during the holiday period. And then there is a deadline very early, and then there are country visits. Maybe you are consulted, maybe not, and then mid-July and July the Commission publishes the report. If you ask any communication expert, that's probably the worst part of the year to publish anything serious, because that's just the pre-holiday or already the holiday season. If you want to publish something which goes completely unnoticed, then do it then, right? And then the second is that the whole why this is important, for whom this matters. It would be great if the report just wouldn't be a very technical, only for experts. If you start to read, you are falling asleep type of document. So country briefs in a language which is understandable for everyone, helping people to realize why rule of law matters would be great. Probably on the language of that country. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. And finally, about the methodology, again, I understand it could be a bit bigger task to change it, but there could be things which could be done very quickly. So create a chapter on civil society and civic space. We actually think that the way how any power is treating civil society organizations in any given country is a very important rule of law indicator. So just give it the light it needs. That would be a very symbolic gesture. Include independent experts at the country visits. Again, I'm only repeating myself, but connect the monitoring mechanism to other not only to the other elements of the toolbox, but to other monitoring exercises. You know, the Fundamental Rights Agency, for example, they are also doing this thing. I'm almost done, but I realized that I started with self-promotion, but I almost missed the most important part. Why Liberties is involved in this? So there is the Commission's annual report, and we, as Civil Liberties Union for Europe, we are actually researching, editing, and publishing our own report, which is very much based on the contribution of our country affiliates and the member organizations, but it's also increasingly involving the work of other organizations. And it's a horrendous work, uh, but it's actually, it shows that if you frame things right, if you research solid facts and you make an effort to communicate about it, that the media actually interested in these things. So it's also rewarding. Thank you so much. I stop here.
Thank you, Balázs. And just one small anecdote which highlights why civil society needs to be treated with more emphasis in the rule of law report. I remember the first year when recommendations were made. The recommendations in the Hungary report concerning civil society, I can't quote it verbatim, but it was like something like "stop harassing civil society," which is, I mean, how do you really follow up on this, and how do you make sure it's not happening? So yes, I very much agree. Well, thank you all for your presentations, and we still have plenty of time for discussion. First, I would like to ask you to whether you have some reflections on each other. I've seen you made notes. Hanna, go ahead. I see you.
Yes, of course, many questions. It's it's fantastic. No, I mean, with the rule of law report, I take all the points you flagged, and I also think it's a matter of communicating and communicating also our asks and our vision in a better way, in a positive narrative, because it seems it's sometimes too legalistic, too technical to be really understood and heard. So I think we need to work a little bit on that and combine that. Then one question I had also about the monitoring system you're establishing here within the new initiative, because I sense, of course, there's a lot of monitoring needed for the national level, but then at the same time, we also sense that some of the restrictions at national level are also due to implementation of EU policy. For example, we know there's money laundering policy at the EU level, which is also closing down the space for civil society at the national level. We also see other EU files which potentially also hamper the space. And how can we also make sure that the monitoring, or are you linking the national monitoring also to the EU level or international level policy action where this is happening?
Yeah, that's a very good question. One that took us a lot of time when we first met in The Hague. Yet to be discussed how it will look like in the national report. But one of sort of the key aspects of what we wanted to create was to monitor also to what extent exactly what you say, EU level framework impact national level restrictions. And there were a few ideas when we start building the methodology, how that will look like. Would it be a separate dimension or a standard as it is right to association of access to funding? It will be more qualitative in nature and it will just be so sort of a description of how that will impact. It will be aligned to each of the standards that we have. That is something that we're going to discuss next week, but it is at the core of what we want to achieve.
See Balázs signing that he wanted to contribute.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, Hanna. And there are really two things here. I think the first is the case when a totally bona fide European legislation goes wrong or implemented in a wrong way. And you know, the GDPR, I think it's really a great regulation. But increasingly, we see that, and it's not only Hungary. It's not. There are other courts and other authorities in other countries which started to implement the GDPR in a way which harms the interest of watchdogs, let it be human rights watchdogs or media watchdogs. I mean, remember the cases when rich people try to get from public databases, despite the fact that they are getting public funding using the GDPR, or companies' privacy rights are protected now under GDPR, which is nonsense, like no company should have. So this is one part of the story. The second, which I think is even more dangerous because it cannot be corrected with good implementation, when the EU does or proposes something which could have terrible consequences on the field. And the so-called Defense for Democracy package and the EU's foreign agent law proposed legislation was exactly an example for that. And I don't think that's over. Here, the only thing what we can do is to propose proper analysis and, again and again rethinking a piece of policy or legislation before it causes harm. And regarding monitoring, I think that should be monitored as well. So it's not only the country level, what's happening there, but also the EU level. In our own report, we do that. There is always selected European issues which are featured.
Thank you. Any more comments from the panel on one another or questions? Before I open the floor to all of you, I also have some questions to various panelists. One is Riccardo, you mentioned the setting up of a working group, maybe it wasn't the right term, in the parliament of supportive maps, MEPs on civic space. Do you have any more details about it, or is just very much still in the making?
So yeah, that's that would be like an interest group. That would be the precise name. So in the parliament there are like intergroup, like on different topics that have like limited numbers, and then interest group which have more or less like the same purpose and dynamics, but being a bit less formal, they're also easier to establish. And the idea would be to, basically to have such space to maintain the relationships with all the allies that we know we have in the parliament. We've been meeting with a lot of MEPs, and we see that actually there is like especially on the progressive side of the parliament, there is support for civil society and also recognition of the work that we do, like in our different capacity. At the same time, it's still like, we're still at the first steps. So this evening during the event I was mentioning, we will be kind of launching for the first time the idea of this interest group, and we will work on it in the next weeks with the aim to have it like established by beginning of 2025.
Thanks, Hanna. You wanted to?
Yes, I think it's absolutely important to consider creating this group of supporting MEPs, and it's already really good on its way. Just a suggestion also, because there are efforts also to renew the social economy intergroup. And there's quite a bit of overlap, and social economy is understood as the four families: associations, foundations, mutual societies, and cooperatives. And they have an interest group, and they also support, for example, the EGBA proposal and the call for enabling frameworks and the call for national strategies for social economy. So there could be maybe some fruitful links to create also with this intergroup. Just a comment.
Thanks, very interesting. Another question I have, that's maybe to several of you, the proposal for the civil dialogue agreement was mentioned by Riccardo and Giada as well. Do you have any details on how it could look like? Where are the main gaps that should be filled? If you could elaborate a bit more on that. I don't know, Giada, you are nodding very much, so maybe.
Yes, so we started this work inside the Civil Society Europe this year, and the first part of it is to agree on some set elements of what this civil dialogue agreement could look like. maybe I do a step back just to say what do we mean by civil dialogue, because it's one of those jargons from Brussels that maybe some might not be familiar with. When we talk about civil dialogue, we talk first of all about systematic inclusion of civil society from the very beginning of identifying priorities for the policy making, to decide the direction of a policy proposal, to the preparation of the policy proposal, implementing, monitoring, and so on. An example of how this is not done at the European level is the Defense of Democracy package that was mentioned by Balázs. When was a civil society? So how did this happen? Von der Leyen, during the State of the Union, launched the idea of a Defense of Democracy package. There was no space for civil society to engage before the State of the Union in a structured way about what should be the content of the State of the Union, what should be the key priorities that von der Leyen highlights in her speech. Then there was no possibility to influence the European Commission work plan following the State of the Union. Of course, as civil society have organized to try to influence that, but it was not a structured part of how the Commission engages with the civil society. Then, between the announcement of the Defense of Democracy package and the stakeholder consultation, of course, we have tried to influence, but there was not really a opportunity to decide what should be the content of this Defense of Democracy package until the stakeholder consultation was open. And at that stage, the content, the elements of this package were already set up. And we know how it went. Among these, there is the directive on yes, it's a very complicated name. Anyway,
transparency of
third party
interest representation services.
Yes, which on top of having a very dangerous element of focusing on foreign funding, there is also an element that it's very badly drafted and in a way doesn't explain what does it mean to act on behalf of third countries. Meaning, does it mean that if we receive funding from a donor, we engage on their priorities and we represent them? This is a very dangerous logic for civil society. So this is an example of how civil dialogue doesn't work. We were engaged in this process too late with very limited space for influencing this policy. Inside the Civil Society Europe, we have started this work, first of all, to identify what do we mean by civil dialogue, and for us, ECF, the element of co-creation of policy, agenda setting, and result-oriented dialogue with the EU institutions is very much at the core. We don't just want to dialogue for the sake of dialogue. We want to to see the result. We are going to organize, as I said, inside the Civil Society Europe. I think there is the plan to organize a bigger coalition of organizations next year to dialogue, to dialogue vis-à-vis the European institutions to set this up. But I want just to mention maybe an element which was inside the mission letter of McGrath, which is the civil society platform. von der Leyen requested McGrath to set up a civil society platform to step up the work, the civil dialogue with the civil society. And we see this as really a place for transversal dialogue, meaning a place where we can discuss exactly these elements of identifying what should be the priorities of the EU policymaking, not just on democracy and rule of law, but across the spectrum, influencing the State of the Union, the work plan of the Commission, and a space where we can work together with the Commission towards an agreement that would strengthen civil dialogue, not just in the Commission, but across the EU institutions.
Thank you.
If I may quickly jump in and complement what Giada was saying, I think there are three elements that I would like to highlight. The first one is that for us, civil dialogue and asking for more engagement of civil society into the policymaker process. I think we're very good, like usually at highlighting the first part of asking, but I think like for me it's very important also to keep also in mind and highlight that we're not asking for the sake of it, but because we have something to offer and we have expertise to bring to inform policies, whether at the EU or at the national level. And in doing so, as civil society, we bring our perspectives and policymakers could agree or not. But I mean, we don't have any private interest to bring at the table when we bring our expertise or our ideas, our proposals regarding a specific piece of legislation. We're not representing a private interest, we're representing public interest. And that's something that for me it's key to take into account, because civil dialogue and more structured mechanisms for civil dialogue would also help counterbalance the imbalance of access from different stakeholders to the policymaking arena and to the policymakers themselves. For the private sector, it's much easier to get access to policymakers, and there are some good data actually from Transparency International at the EU level, and you see that the higher you get in the hierarchy scale, and the more difficult it is for non-profit organizations to get involved and to have meetings at the commissioner level, let alone at the president of the commission level, while for the private sector it's much easier. They have more resources, they have more, mainly more resources to do that. So that's also something that we want to achieve through a civil dialogue agreement, to really make this how can I say this field of play more balanced and more even.
Thank you. I see also Hanna wants to contribute. I see this issue very much engages everybody. But before you go on, maybe I could also, because I wanted to turn with the last question to you and to Hanna, so you can maybe address that as well. You were talking about, and Balázs was also mentioning the issue of funding. You talked about the need for more cooperation or coordination among private and public donors. And I was just wondering whether it's still a plan, or has there been some steps already taken? So if you could reply to this as well, that would be great.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, responding to your last question, indeed, there are informal steps about creating the dialogue. So there were some conversations happening, and we aim to continue the conversation to see how to put this in a more structured way to engage in this dialogue. So that's the way forward. And yeah, we are, of course, happy to keep you all posted of how this progresses. And in parallel to that, as I mentioned, also there is, of course, the need to engage also the both constituency with the civil society in a meaningful dialogue, and to ensure that this also happens. Coming back to also this call for a civil society platform, I think it will be very important also for the sector to make some proposals of how the sector considers this could look like. And then very important work that civil society is doing about this civil dialogue agreement. We're also part of the conversations, and it's also something that, of course, we have Article 11, which already provides for this. We have to make sure that this is also built upon, used, and better implemented. So we do not necessarily need a treaty change for that, but we can use already this as a hook to ensure potentially a better implementation of Article 11. And of course, the issue of funding, yes, there is the discussion about inequality around, democratic decision making, and that will need to be discussed and potentially addressed. We also sense, of course, that this kind of dialogue and the civil society will need to be funded also to engage in a dialogue for it to be meaningful. So that would need to be, of course, conversations to continue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now it's time. We talked a lot, so it's nice time for you. So I'm opening the floor to comments and questions. My colleague will go around with a mic. May I steal a mic? Any hands?
Thank you. Sorry, just trying to find my notes among many other apps I have on my phone. Thank you so much for this conversation, which is, like, I would say, cross-sectoral, not only very complex or comprehensive in terms of what you presented. I have maybe not remarks, but comments or suggestions connected with two issues, the rule of law report and CERV, actually, but I think I would try to connect both of them. Oh, sorry, Krzysztof Izdebski, Batory Foundation, Poland. Talking about CERV, I mean, it's super important mechanism and a tool. We're super happy that we have it, etc. But I think also we should be more ambitious than just thinking about repeating the scheme. I think there's a hook also in what von der Leyen was talking in terms of the democracy shield. And why not discuss, maybe there will be a space to do it tomorrow in the afternoon, about something that we could call democracy, or like democracy resilience fund, for example, which is much wider than just CERV, because altogether, I mean, I'm super pro EU values, but it doesn't allow us, for example, to be really engaged in, for example, the process of writing and submitting our opinions to the rule of law report, and then working with the rule of law report. I mean, there's no really a space for monitoring, for engagement, the things that also Balázs mentioned in terms of not only the rule of law report, but being present and active. So that's my, I would say, proposal just on the table, why we should, I mean, that maybe we could discuss being a bit more ambitious than just limiting ourselves to CERV, but thinking about something also much bigger in terms of the budget. I think it's definitely needed in terms of the global situation, not only the situation in the EU. There is a window of opportunity, I think, especially in coming months in terms of the new budget, but also whole discussions, and which is ironically maybe the President Trump, being a President Trump, will also motivate the EU leaders to do more in terms of protecting democracy, and the CSOs are the best. The one the best can do this. Thanks so much. That's it. I don't know. I mean, if you want to. I mean, sorry, I don't want to take your role as a moderator. This was my comment, and that's it. I'm finishing. Thank you.
Thank you. First, maybe some other hands, questions or comments. Yes, over there.
Thank you. I'm Gergely Pelbat. I'm representing an NGO focusing on drug addiction, and I would like to raise the topic of core foundations, because as I see, most of the grants or funds are focusing on projects, and as I see, a lot of NGOs are unable to provide their own basic fund to be able to provide their basic services. And as I see, it would be much efficient if there would be more core funds because as Balázs said, if we can work in a safe environment in a 5 or 10-year framework, then we could start on building and focusing on to be enable ourselves for advocacy and participating on a transnational level. So my question to the panel is, what do you think, how can we together work towards this topic, or what do you think about this question?
Thank you. Any reply? Hanna, I see you.
Yeah, no, I think this question of core funding is very important and has been flagged also in the context of CERV and other EU funding programs. I mean, there is also the Justice Program. There are other programs which are potentially relevant for civil society organizations. And it's something that, of course, the sector needs to formulate and engage with whatever is possible at the level of the EU funding programs. I think it has been formulated also with a lot of the contributions from civil society on both CERV and also into the future perspective of the next MFF, so that this is considered and taken into account and flagged as a concern. What you referred to is also, of course, applicable to the private philanthropy foundation sector, for them to also understand that there is this need for unrestricted or more unrestricted funding. Again, some foundations are considering this, are looking into this. Some are not able to do it either for legal purposes or for their own statutory restrictions in that direction. But there is generally a perception that more foundations are also thinking into the way of systems change, wanting to do systems change funding, and hence also sometimes considering trust-based philanthropy, where they're indeed willing also to give a certain grant with the perspective of also building the organization. Then another element that maybe fits into this picture is also considerations about participatory grant making, where foundations are also considering that bringing into other constituencies, either into their governance or into some of their decision-making processes, can also add new perspectives and also create more legitimacy around some of the funding decisions. So these are all discussions that are happening. But with regard to the big question of how to bring this forward, of course, into the EU funding mechanisms, that is something that, of course, there needs to be direct engagement with the EU policymakers on this to make the point. And I've been hearing a lot of civil society voices already speaking up in that direction.
Okay. Further questions, comments? Oh, yes.
Hi, my name is Zoltán Zarandi from Hungary, representing a number of fields, including independent media and a foundation that is in charge of a network of independent media in Hungary, especially in the countryside. One of them is called Catch Up in Kecskemét, nothing to do with tomatoes, just media freedom. I also work in the field of community development and urban development as well. So the cooperation or the contribution of civics and NGOs into sustainable urban development and regional development. Let me just make very briefly. Sorry, because Vera knows me, but I try to be brief. Just a few comments and a few questions, if I may, because first of all, I'd like to congratulate Vera and all the panel and all those who are involved in this magnificent initiative of civil EU presidency, not just because of the Hungarian context that you're familiar with. It's basically oxygen for us, intellectual oxygen. Hopefully, an oxygen that can be an intellectual capital and a civic capital, social capital, and knowledge capital that maybe gradually can be transferred into financial capital as well in the coming years, perhaps, because that we also need, to say the least. I also like to congratulate for this particular panel, because that it makes me a bit more optimistic than usual, that you are basically representing, you are giants. I mean, you are giants relative giants, of course. But you're representing the EU level or the Hungarian level. You are the kind of blue chip, or you are the avant-garde of the NGO sector, and also the avant-garde of lobbying. And you have an impact. You already have made a huge impact. And of course, we're representing, many of us here represent tiny NGOs with no or very little funding and very little, some courage, but courage which is kind of fading because of these threats that we have every day, criminalization, etc. So I would be very interested to know, maybe it's a bit philosophical, but I'm here as a journalist, so I might like to make some very short interviews later on with some of you on how you assess the real possibility of the possibility that we can actually really can contribute and get access to decision making from this micro level. So what if the dream of the European fathers of subsidiarity comes into action, because that is a key to our democracy and key to the future of Europe. I'd be very interested in the CERV program, which is already through Vera's magnificent work and also the CERV in Brussels, providing a number of brilliant kind of lifelines to media outlets and also for urban communities and NGOs. I'd be particularly interested on how you see, especially Hanna, the possibility of getting additional funding for CERV and also providing a direct access, increased direct access to urban communities and NGOs, especially in our countries, which are over centralized and over authoritarian, or who represent the governments of which represent the very opposite of European values. I was so interested in some legal advice, or not legal, but the legal environment in which we are threatened under the sovereignty, kind of inverted commas, sovereignty threat, this Damocles sword hanging over the NGOs and also the media increasingly. We already in the Hungarian parliament, it's going to be very soon tabled a new piece of legislation directly criminalizing anybody who can be labeled as serving pro-war, pro-Ukrainian or pro-EU activities and values. And that also means that we are, especially in the countryside, but also in Budapest, many intellectuals, many NGO representatives are considering leaving Hungary very soon because they jeopardized. And also at a very, very macro level, the global cooperation between European and American funding. Especially sitting in this very building, Central European University premises, commemorating briefly George Soros, who actually contributed so much since 1984 in Hungary in the Open Society Fund, has been ousted. The university, as you know, is in Vienna now, the main premises and the academic world. What happens after George Soros is leaving or already left Europe? Is there any initiative from Brussels to actually sit down with the Open Society Fund or any American donors, possibly with the National Endowment, in Washington, D.C., regardless of what happened last week in Washington in the elections? Because many of us in the countryside and also in Budapest do depend exceedingly, overwhelmingly on foreign support from Washington, D.C., and from Brussels. And so much for the time being. Thanks very much for your patience. And I'm really, really glad to be here.
Thank you very much for your kind words. I think it's very important to link the local national perspective with what they call the Brussels bubble. Big questions. I don't know if you have answers to them. Hanna, you want to go ahead?
Well, only some initial answers. First of all, yes, there is of course a strategic decision by a couple of foundations to change the way they work, and that's something where also the rest of the funder community will need to react and engage and consider, and there are conversations happening. With regard to what you mentioned with the US sector and the European sector, we are conscious that we need to strengthen further even the transatlantic donor dialogue also. There needs to be a strong bridge between the US foundations who have a strong tradition also in operating in Europe and collaborating with European foundations to continue to do this and to make each other also aware of the respective situations. So I think that will be happening. Yes, then the CERV and kind of direct access or through intermediaries. I think it is an important statement or contribution also to make to the CERV and to the next edition of CERV to consider that there needs to be an assurance that also the funding gets to the grassroots level, and through working with intermediaries, that was the whole idea of providing for that, and that was very successful, as I heard. But of course, looking into being more ambitious and coming back also to what you said is, yes, I think this is now, of course, the moment also to reflect upon the new MFF, because that is the moment now to be creative, to make proposals, to think through structurally what are the big dangers, the big challenges, and where does funding need to go to really make a difference? And will that be a need to change funding structures? But sensing that the CERV has been a real change maker and a real success story. I'm advocating, or we have been advocating, for it to be reconsidered, redrafted, but for sure for it, and in this, it can be in different format, of course, but for the funding for civil society and for the EU values and democracy to continue and be even strengthened. But I think your plea for a democracy fund is also now the moment to reinforce that, because that's really, and there are, of course, as you probably are aware, there are discussions going on already how the next MFF will look like, and
sorry, maybe for those who don't know, the MFF is the multi-annual financial framework, meaning the 7-year EU budget. Sorry.
That's the problem, that we in the Brussels bubble sometimes talk very much jargon, and apologies for that.
I also want to take some of these points. So starting with the core funding, I think it's very important to articulate the issue as a democracy issue, meaning precarious organizations precarious funding means vulnerable organizations, and so vulnerable democracy. So this is how we are trying to articulate these, and we try to push this narrative vis-a-vis the EU institutions. And we hope that with the next MFF, we will be able to push for this. I think that it's interesting to look at the EA Norway Grants Active Citizen Fund. I know that some of you are in the room, and I know that fund operators have experimented with the progressive grant making. And what is particularly interesting is that this is public funding. So they piloted some examples of progressive grant making, including core funding. And I think it would be interesting to hear the experiences and to share that this can be done also with public funding. Then in terms of the next MFF, in the ECF, we are thinking along those lines of how to, how to go beyond the CERV. This is also in relations to the question of the post-Soros philanthropy. what I was saying before, and I think it's important to say it again. I think that the EU has a role to play, not just in terms of disbursing funding, that's important, but also in terms of really sending a signal to donors that there is an issue and donors need to invest in civil society working on democracy and rights. Yes, I hear the importance of the US donors, but I wonder, but I think that we also need more European philanthropy in these, also providing core funding for this work. I also think that there is some positive news in terms of funding to Hungary in terms of the annual week grants potential, that there might be a possibility to apply from Hungary as well.
Yeah, hopefully, because the active citizen funds or the civil society support programs are now not part of the bilateral agreements between the donor countries and the beneficiary governments, but treated as a separate fund.
So this is a window of opportunity. We will see what will happen, but to say that maybe there are some seeds of hope. We are also with the work on protection that I mentioned before, one of the venues that we as civil society will need to explore is how to connect the CERV intermediaries, the ring granting scheme, with the protection ecosystem. So I know that the Commission is interested in potentially looking at this angle. So I think that in this green picture, there are some hopeful seeds that we can grow together.
Okay, thank you. Our time is slowly up for this session. I see two hands from the panel, but I just wanted to ask whether there are any questions from the floor. We can continue the discussion after lunch. There will be plenty opportunity. So then I would give the floor to Hanna and to Balázs for very short interventions, and then we go into a coffee break.
Yes, a very small intervention. What I forgot to say is that, of course, in addition to foreign donors, be they coming from the US or other European countries, it is very important also to strengthen local philanthropy and local giving, and to have enabling frameworks also for local companies, communities, individuals to also strengthen this tradition and also the possibility. So that was a comment I forgot, but that's equally important, that this needs to be, built and nurtured also to for more a sustainable future. Thank you.
Balázs?
Thank you so much, Hanna. That's exactly what I wanted to say.
Good.
Because however effective European rule of law monitoring and other type of actions exist out there, there will be situations when they won't be effective. I mean, think about the Hungarian sovereignty law. This is not without history. There was a law, foreign funding, labeling organizations who got funding from the EU and from others. There was an infringement procedure. There was a court procedure. The Court of Justice of the EU said that this is unlawful. So Hungary had to revoke the law. But half a year later came the sovereignty law. So, if you have an agenda, what Hungary's government has, there no international or intergovernmental or any political organization will prevent you to doing that. So let's be realistic, because that's good. And the second thing is on funding. I think the CERV is a wonderful instrument, and it's great that the EU is spending money to support organizations, but local funding is always going to be the king of any funding, because it does not give you only core funding, what you can use for anything what you want. In most cases, if you collect donations from people, think about the one person donations, one person income tax donations, but it also gives you credibility and legitimacy, and that's what NGOs need the most, because that's the question we got very often, not only at the country level, but also at the around European discussions. Whom are you exactly representing? And this could hit several birds with the same stone or flies. Thank you.
Thank you, Balázs. I think it's a very good conclusion. Though the representation issue is something we can continue on in the afternoon. And you also said it's not nice to self-promote, but I will too. For the Hungarian participants, if you happen not to know it, the call or current call in the CERV program is still open for applications until the 2nd of December. So check out közösértékeink.hu. And maybe one last thing on EU advocacy. What I learned during the couple of last few years is that besides money, there is another thing you need for EU advocacy, and that is patience. So things are moving very slow in the EU, but eventually they are moving. And on that note, I would close this panel. Thank you very much for the really broad overview. And after the coffee break, we will continue from here with Ingrid Bellander-Todino from the DG Justice and Waltraud Herler of the Fundamental Rights Agency. We will see you back at noon, 12 noon sharp. Thank you.